In this session, we're going to discuss the beginnings of rock and roll and have a particular or pay particular attention to the issue of cover tunes. Now, of course, cover tunes existed prior to the 1950s. Some artists did songs that were already made famous by other artists. We see this a lot in country and in blues and in most of the genres of music. But in the 50s, cover tunes took on a sort of special nature, as we'll see. And this is a part of what happens in the 50s is that we're talking about more cross-racial covering. And the direction is usually an original by black artists being covered by white artists. And we'll see that some of this had to do with a fairly canny business sense and perhaps a rather unfair business sense on the part of the music industry. So something new, what were the social and cultural conditions for rock and roll? Some of this is the Ralph Peer legacy, that country or hillbilly music and R&B, race started off as marginal genres with respect to marketability. Now they're at the center of sales. These are, instead of pop music being the sort of bastion of mainstream sales and hillbilly music and race music, or now country music and R&B being really more niche oriented audiences, poor whites and blacks, and remember that early in their history they thought there wasn't even any real purchasing audience for that, but now after World War II, both R&B and country music are becoming more central to American musical expression, to U.S. musical expression. And so, of course, these are marketing labels. So just as was the case with hillbilly and race, the label rock and roll was employed as a marketing tool, and it was really meant to target the baby boomers. This was a younger audience that had typically been targeted, in part because after World War II and the increasing prevalence of allowances in families, adolescents had more disposable money than ever before. It's easy to think of the notion of teenagers as being universal, as being something that goes all the way back in history, but that's simply not so. For most of history, of Western history, there are of course babies and then children, and then once you're no longer a child, you're a young adult, and then you go on to full adulthood, right? And the period of 16 to 18 is when you're moving into adulthood. But after World War II, and keep in mind that the 1950s, of course, was a period of great affluence, a lot of extra wealth for people, a great sense of stability, even though this is also the period, I don't want to overemphasize the notion of stability, because this is also the period, of course, of Martin Luther King's bus boycott and his various other endeavors on behalf of civil rights. And, of course, there's also, especially in the South, the emergence of a backlash against civil rights. 1954 is Brown versus the Board of Education, and there was a great deal of backlash against that all the way into the early 60s, all the way into the presidency of John F. Kennedy. So I'm not trying to pretend that the 50s were without their very serious issues, but the overall experience of white America, at least, was one of relative stability outside of the Korean War, which had a comparatively minor impact compared to both World War II on the one hand and Vietnam on the other. This is not to say that the Korean War didn't have a huge impact on some towns and obviously on many lives, but it didn't have the national visibility that both World War II and Vietnam did. So after World War II, we have really a new category, this category of a teenager, where you're still a child, but you're old enough to have a greater deal of independence, and more importantly, you don't necessarily have a job. The very notion of allowances is a fairly new notion after World War II. There weren't allowances for the most part before that. You got a job, and the chores that you did because that was part of what you had to do in a family. I mean, some of us, I'm sure some of you were still raised that way. I didn't get an allowance when I was a kid, but my mom did. I mean, or actually she didn't. My father did though, because that was a part of their generation. And this was much more typical, this idea of allowances. So what do you have now? You have young adults who have a whole bunch of, well, not a whole bunch, but they have some money, and they don't have any requirements for that money. They're not paying rent. They're not paying for food unless it's just snack food or burgers or whatever. So they have a lot of disposable income, and that allows them to spend it on things like records. So this creates a new market. Whereas before, for the most part, the industry was selling to adults, young adults and established adults. Now they're going to start selling to teenagers because that's where the money is. They have the money to spend on things that don't matter as much as, say, food and rent and shelter and utilities and so on. We are, of course, talking about the Eisenhower era, right? And sometimes referred to as the period of Eisenhower conformity. The 1950s were an era of economic security and relative social conformity, right? Again, of course, there was a great deal of racial unrest, but for the most part, this was an era where there's more and more movement to the suburbs. The highway system is being improved, so it's easier to get around the country and to travel at greater distances. Airplane travel is being improved during this time. This is an important era for just the wealth of the U.S. And this is also a period of relative social conformity, right? Unlike we'll see with the 60s, this was a period where the idea of being part of mainstream culture wasn't necessarily square for the most part, right? Until, of course, the emergence of rock and roll. Rock and roll offered a kind of symbolic form of rebellion. I say symbolic because it's largely harmless, despite the propaganda. I mean, especially people of my parents' generation, the baby boomers, they'll write about rock and roll, and I'm sure you've seen some documentaries about rock and roll, where the people of that generation talk about it as though, we changed the world and everything was upended at this point. And it is true that rock and roll participated in some of the movement of Brown versus the Board of Education that at times, not always, at times, an artist like Little Richard is playing in front of integrated audiences. Sometimes those audiences were still divided in the sense that one half of the room was white, one half of the room was black. But, one of Little Richard's favorite anecdotes, and we know that it is true sometimes and wasn't true at other times, is that, a lot of times these dance halls where he would be playing would have a rope, a sort of velvet rope, a fake velvet rope that divided the two sides, and that the rope would eventually come down and everyone was dancing together. And that did happen sometimes in the North, and it happened a lot less in the South. Little Richard hated touring in the South for good reason. It was even though he's from the South and he's from New Orleans, he's used to the culture there, but the rest of the South, New Orleans, of course, is kind of a special place. At any rate, I think this is important to keep in mind, that it's easy to over-romanticize rock and roll. There's a lot of things that are important about rock and roll. We're going to try to talk about them. But the idea that it really challenges the racial lines, that's propaganda. It does to a certain extent. It does here and there. But a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today were not challenging the racial divide. They were enforcing and reinforcing the racial divide. That's part of the story of the cover tunes that we're going to cover today. So this notion of a minor rebellion was partly its association with blackness. And, Little Richard, Fats Domino is an even better example. We'll come back to Little Richard, but Fats Domino is this very, he's even though he's very young when he first hits the scene, he looks older, and he's very calm and reserved, and he looks kind of gentlemanly, and he's not wild in the way that Little Richard is. And so he's a very important crossover artist for that reason. He appeals to this notion of a bit of blackness that still feels safe, right? Whereas Little Richard felt a little less safe, and the same with Chuck Berry, which is part of what causes them problems, and we'll talk about that when we get to them soon. Of course, I've mentioned this several times, but let's talk about it now. Once again, 1954 is Brown versus the Board of Education, and that officially ends school segregation. So once again, we can use this distinction between de jure and de facto, right? In the sense of de jure, of by the law or of the law, Brown versus the Board of Education ends segregation. But of course, in effect, by matter of fact, de facto, it does not end segregation right away. It's not like a switch is turned in 1954 and everything's just fine, right? This is still the period of civil rights activists getting blasted by hoses and beaten by cops and dogs sicked on them. This is still a period where many of the schools, even though racial segregation has ended according to law, many of the schools are still segregated. And they're working out whether or not there should be busing. They're working out how they're going to integrate the schools. And plenty of the schools in the South are just openly resisting this. They're refusing to integrate. And the government, the presidency, both Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy, are somewhat circumspect in the way that they handle this, right? John F. Kennedy, for instance, takes on the governor of Alabama, and it's a very famous moment because it was filmed as a documentary film. He allowed the cameras in, but that makes it look like, he's bravely shutting these things down. He took baby steps to get there, and so did Eisenhower. And so we're not talking about the kind of change that should have happening right away, right? We're not quite, but we're getting close to 100 years after the end of the Civil War. The Civil War ends in 1865. We're now talking about 1954. Not quite 100 years later, but getting closer. Nearly 90 years later, and still that notion of advancement is coming at a crawl. But this idea that education, and then, with the Brown versus the Board of Education, the whole separate but equal thing starts to crumble, because that was the argument being made, was that separate education was not equal. And we know it's not. Study after study after study has shown that it's not. And we still, to some extent, have de facto segregation in our schools in the U.S., and even if your argument is, well, you go to the school in your neighborhood, the schools in the poor neighborhoods are often funded less when they need to be funded more than the successful schools, because they're the ones that have the issues that have to be addressed, whether those are behavioral issues related to trauma, and so on. So this is an important moment in legislation. It's one of the great moments in U.S. legislation, but it doesn't fix everything right away, and we'll see how that plays into popular culture. So teen culture is what we're talking about here. What we're dealing with is a shift from racial to generational audiences. For the most part, prior to this moment, prior to the mid-50s, when we're talking about popular music, we've been talking about crossovers, of course, but crossover artists like Louis Jordan, they're fairly rare and they're sort of special, and that's why, the Decca Records had the Sepia series specifically for crossover artists. Capitol Records pushed Nat King Cole as a crossover artist, but not all of their artists were pushed in that way. So for the most part, when you're talking about audiences prior to the mid-50s, you're talking about racially divided audiences and economically divided audiences. Up until World War II, country music mostly would have been listened to in a regional sense. People from the South, either living in the South or having come out of the South. In generally an economic bracket, it was usually lower middle class listeners, right? And white. Blues would have been mostly listened to by black family members, by black listeners. Gospel would have been more on the side of black audiences, and so on, right? So you have this racial divide. But now in the 1950s, it becomes a generational divide, much more so than before. Swing music's a good example of something before. There were young swing fanatics, right, who were in their late teens, early 20s. But swing music also appealed to people who were quite a bit older, right? There wasn't that same sense of this music is alienating, the music of the youth is alienating the older generation in the way that there was starting in 1955 roughly and ever since, right? I mean, my mother, of course, grew up in this generation, and her mother constantly said, what's all this noise that you're listening to? And then, of course, I grew up in the generation listening to Guns N' Roses and so on, and my mother says, what's all that noise? What is this Metallica stuff? It's terrible. Can't listen to it, right? So now we're all very used to this idea of a generational divide, but that was a fairly new thing. So a lot of the ways that we understand how teenage culture works, what it is to be a teenager, what it is to listen to music as a young person. A lot of that is shaped in these years, 1955 roughly. So this is the emergence of a teen culture, not a child, not an adult. This created a certain amount of chart confusion, where songs like Carl Perkins' Blue Suede Shoes and Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel, they topped the country and western, the R&B, and the pop chart simultaneously. And Elvis did that quite a few times, where he had the number one or near the number one for all three charts. And so for a little while there, these charts, they almost become less significant than they were before. Crossover was, at least for a moment, the new norm, the normative expectation for rock and roll. So now you have very disparate audiences, racially and economically, poor and rich. People who considered themselves very sophisticated and would normally be interested in classical music and so on. If they're young, they're listening to rock and roll. And we'll see that also in the early 60s with the twist phenomenon and so on. That was very popular among very wealthy people, aristocrats. And then black and white and Latino, we're talking about people listening to basically the same music. They might emphasize certain artists a little differently, but the same basic style of music. Of course, there are also increasing technological advances at this time. So television is more and more a mainstay in homes, and you have shows that represent the American family, like The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, where they have two sons, Ricky, and I can't remember the other one right now. I don't know. At any rate, they have the two sons, and of course all the little familial problems. But it's basically the nuclear family, right? And that's the notion of the nuclear family, which was taking shape already moving into World War II. After World War II, becomes a real kind of American or U.S. ideology that this is the way it is. You don't tend to live with your extended family anymore. You're not living. You're really focusing more on the nuclear family, the mother, the father, and the sons and daughters. Also on television, of course, is American Bandstand, a show that's basically just playing records and then having kids dance to it, right? And as we'll talk about when we get to Dick Clark, that was quite a wide audience too. In fact, he said he was often shocked at how older people love to watch that show because they like to watch young people dance, like to watch young people move, the nostalgia of it all. And of course, the other thing, another important technological advance of the 50s is the transistor radio. Car radios were they were around, but they're somewhat unreliable. So people would carry around these transistor radios, and they could get pretty good signals, and you could carry them in your pocket, and you could put them on your dashboard. That was very typical in the 50s. That it would work better than the car radio. So you would put them on your dashboard and drive around with it, or hang it from the rearview mirror. So the transistor radio allowed especially young people to have music wherever they were going, right? Wherever they were. So this is a period of a great deal of expansion of the music business. The record sales rose from 191 million in 1951 to 514 million in 1959. So over the course of the 1950s, we're talking about a great deal of growth, more than double. The diversity of early rock and roll was encouraged in part by the proliferation of important indie record companies. So this is we've seen this over and over again, right? In the beginning of jazz in the 20s, there was an explosion of these independent record companies. And then in the 50s, of course, we've already talked about the explosion of independent record companies with respect to R&B, and now we're seeing it with rock and roll as well. So the major labels at this point are RCA Victor, Capitol, which has become a major label in part because of Nat King Cole and in part because of its ventures into country music, Mercury Records, Columbia, of course, which has been a major one for a long time. MGM, and we talked about the beginnings of MGM. They started as a film company and then, of course, moved into music, and then Decca. But there are a whole bunch, as you can see here, a whole bunch of these smaller record companies: Savoy, Dot, Discovery, Little Wonder. There are a ton of them, right? That some of them just are almost fly-by-night companies that are only around for a little while and then disappear. Others of them become fairly important. A lot of them get bought out by the majors, and we'll talk about that as it happens. But right now, what they're doing is they're providing a great deal of variety where there might not have been otherwise. Because keep in mind that for the most part, major companies aren't going to take risks, right? They're going to find a formula that works and they're going to stick to it, because the idea is to put as much money as you can behind the things that work to get the maximum revenue out of it. You don't want to waste money on experimenting, but that's all the independent companies do, because they're just trying to throw anything they can at the wall and see what sticks. So the independent companies are usually much more flexible. They get the kind of artists that aren't established, and therefore they are usually the ones that discover the new fads, the new things. Alan Freed is an important part of the rise of rock and roll. He's a DJ in Cleveland, playing on what he calls the Moondog Show, and of course, he's one of these talent DJs, these personality DJs, is what they're sometimes called, personality jocks. DJ, of course, disc jockey, but they're sometimes also called, these guys are called personality jocks, because it's not just about listening to the records that they play. You're listening to hear him, right? And he's got his own little style of banter. And there were several DJs. DJs really come to a great deal of prominence in the 1950s, as we'll see, and it comes to change the industry, and we'll see how that works. But at any rate, he's on the Moondog Show, and so of course he's howling and whoo, howl at the moon kind of stuff, right? Nightly in Cleveland, where he features R&B records. So this is part of what makes Cleveland such an important early rock and roll city. I don't know if you are already familiar with that, but Cleveland was a major city for early rock and roll. That Cleveland is where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is housed today. He found young white teens were his primary audience, even though he was mostly playing black R&B records. And that's what's interesting about Freed, is for the most part, he's not interested in the white rock and rollers. He's really interested in black R&B and early rock and roll from black artists, and he really supports them. And we'll talk about that as well. He probably coined the term rock and roll. It was clearly derived from the prevalence of references to rockin' and rollin' in R&B lyrics. So, for instance, Good Rockin' Tonight by Roy Brown, right, which was number 13 in 47, but was also famously recorded by Wynonie Harris and became a number 1 and remained on the charts for 6 months. And it was the Wynonie Harris record that Alan Freed often played. And then later in 1954, it was recorded by Elvis. And then, of course, 60-Minute Man by the Dominoes from 1950, and that was a favorite record of Alan Freed's. And that's where they use rockin' and rollin' to very clearly substitute for just talking about sex, right? That they're rockin' and rollin' all night long. And then he's a 60-minute man. He's the last thing. So remember, there's 20 minutes of teasing, 20 minutes of pleasing, and 20 minutes of blowing his top. So it's pretty open what they're talking about there. And as is often the case, I mean, jazz, the origin of that term has to do with sex and things that go along with sex. And rockin' and rollin' is a synonym, a sort of jive synonym for having sex. He promoted a series of concert tours featuring black artists for a racially mixed audience. And sometimes this caused him some trouble. There was a riot in Boston, for instance, and he had a police record because of that. But he promoted that idea very much, that the audiences should be mixed. He's mostly, like I said, promoting black performers. He also, you can probably find on YouTube, several movies with Alan Freed, which are just basically versions of his live performances with a really thin, stupid plot to hold everything together. But it's just one cameo after another of these really great R&B and early rock and roll performers. he called these rock and roll reviews, right? So again, popularizing this term, which was quite new at that time. In 1954, he moves to WINS in New York City, and to some extent, that might have been the beginning of his downfall. It's of course a much bigger market, New York versus Cleveland. It was a more powerful station, and so it carried throughout a good part of the nation. So it was much more prestigious, but we'll see that prominence also gave him some trouble. He wound up having a TV show for a little while, but it was canceled in 1957 when Frankie Lyman, of Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, appeared dancing with a white girl. So Frankie Lyman, the lead singer, young black man, dancing with a white girl, and that of course upset the national sponsors, especially because they were worried about losing audiences or losing customers from the South, and so they canceled his television show. So you can see 1954 really didn't fix things. Not that I think any of you expected that it did, but this just reinforces that. 1958 was what I was talking about before. He's arrested for anarchy and incitement of a riot when a fight breaks out at one of his concerts in Boston, right? And again, he's being accused of it being a racial issue, that because he allows for integration, that this is leading to all sorts of problems. Now, I think this is part of why he gets targeted as strongly as he does in the payola hearings. And we're going to talk more about the payola hearings in our very last session. But this was the early 60s, and he's prosecuted for payola along with Dick Clark and the others. But he really gets the book thrown at him. Dick Clark walks away pretty free, and most of the others are fined or whatever, but they're not ruined. Alan Freed is ruined, and I think partly he's ruined because of his prominence and because of his association with largely black music. Now, I'm not trying to make him out to be some kind of charitable figure either. I mean, he was very devoted to the people that he admired. But one of the things that he would often do is give quote-unquote advice on record. So a lot of the artists that he admired, their managers were more or less bribing him but for advice. Now, he was giving them advice, so I don't know, maybe it wasn't a bribe. It's hard. There's a sort of thin line here, right? I mean, some of these DJs were getting money for advice that they weren't really giving. The record was already done. They were being paid to play the record. A lot of times with Alan Freed, it seems that the advice was sought before the record was being mixed for the final mix. He was much more involved with a lot of these performers. And he sometimes got writing credit, and people argue whether or not he deserved the writing credit for some of those songs. But of course, when he has writing credit, he's going to promote that song more. It's in his self-interest. So we'll talk more about the whole payola thing soon. But notice that DJs are becoming much more important here. They're having a lot more power, and they're personalities. They're not just spinning records anonymously. You know that you're listening to Alan Freed, and you want to hear some of his banter, some of what he says about this record, or some element of it. So people often talk about the 5 streams of rock and roll, right? And I would say there are probably 6, really, that we should keep in mind. So that's how I'm going to put it. Other people say, well, the idea of talking about streams is kind of silly, but I don't think so. Rock and roll is not a straightforward thing. Just like I hope I showed earlier that the blues is not a straightforward thing. Then it draws on elements of religious music. It draws on elements of ragtime, of course, and minstrelsy and so on. The same applies to rock and roll. Rock and roll is a hybrid genre from its very essence. Right, so it's drawing on the Chicago blues, especially through Chuck Berry, who is of course one of the great early rock and rollers, and he's performing on Chess Records, and he's clearly drawing from Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and T-Bone Walker and so on. Right, so he's drawing from the jump blues, he's drawing from Chicago blues, and the same with Bo Diddley, who's also on Chess Records for a while. The next stream would be doo-wop. Right, and we talked a bit about this last time. The harmony groups like the Dominoes. We'll talk about the chords in just a second. So these groups that are usually 5, or sometimes 4, sometimes 6, but usually around 5 black singers that sing in harmony. Sometimes there's one lead singer that for all the tunes, and sometimes they trade off and so on. But they're using these kind of R&B inflected harmonies. A lot of them get their start just being harmony groups that don't even have instruments recording behind them, but usually in the studio they're using instruments. Then you have New Orleans piano, Fats Domino and Little Richard, and we'll talk about that soon in an upcoming session. And we'll talk about Chuck Berry, of course, in an upcoming session. Then you have the Northern bands. Bill Haley and the Comets are the big example of that. And we'll talk about them in just a moment. Rockabilly, which we'll talk about in an upcoming session. Sun Records, Elvis, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis. And then you have the white pop youth music. The Everly Brothers, Pat Boone, Ricky Nelson, right? And we'll talk a bit about Pat Boone today. Ricky Nelson we might touch on a little bit at the beginning of the next semester. The Everly Brothers are a good example of coming out of a sort of country aspect, right? They're very influenced by country music and to a certain extent Hank Williams and so on, and so they and like Roy Orbison and these other sort of they're more youth music, youth music. Roy Orbison actually gets a start as a rockabilly artist, but we'll talk about that soon. So the Everly Brothers, of course, have elements of the harmony thing going. They're also kind of teen idols before the fad for teen idols in the early 60s. Now, cover versions. A cover version, when we say cover, of course, we're just talking about the practice of recording a song that has previously been recorded by another artist or group. Then this practice is prevalent and it goes in all directions, from pop to country, country to pop, R&B to country, black to white, white to black. So it's not a big deal. We've been talking about cover versions all along, on and off, right? We've seen plenty of people do songs that other people made famous, and sometimes even doing songs that other people wrote, right? In early rock and roll, though, this was often a strategy to accomplish a dual agenda. On the one hand, it was to cash in on an already established or partially established success, especially when major labels have their artists cover a song recorded on an independent label. And then second, it was an attempt to gain a wider audience by having white performers clean up a black R&B tune. So both of these are problematic. This is where cover tunes go from being an innocent, oh, this is just, I'm just playing my version of the song, what's the big deal, to something a little more pernicious. So let's talk about this in a little more detail, right? First of all, keep in mind that even though copyright laws have gotten a lot better over the course of what we've talked about this semester, and they've gotten a lot more protective when it comes to this form of music, rock and roll music, which is mostly not written down, which is mostly the same kinds of chord progressions over and over again. I mean, so many of the rock and roll tunes are just a blues progression, right? Copyright is very, very loose indeed, right? And a lot of times, the independent labels can't even afford the court fees that it would cost to sue for copyright. Now, we'll see an example where there was a suit, and we'll see what happened with it. But so this is one of those ways in which the major labels have an advantage, because they have more marketing, and they have better studios, and so on. So let's say that Dot Records, a very small record company, puts out a song, and Dot Records had a lot of black artists on it, and let's say they put out a song by a black artist, and Columbia says, oh, that song has potential, it did pretty well considering it barely had any publicity behind it, let's have one of our artists do it, probably a white artist, and really, really push it, right? Then they're going to have the famous version of that song, and for the most part, that's the version that'll get on the radio because Columbia has all the connections. That's the version that people will know and buy, and that's the version that'll make money. So you're doing two things. You're sort of erasing the intellectual property, if you want to call it that, or creative property, whatever you want to call it, of these smaller businesses, these independent labels, and you're also erasing blackness. You're masking the origins of this music. Now, that's not always a problem, obviously, when you have an even playing field and you have a situation where everyone is has equal access to the means of dissemination, the means of promotion. But that's not the case here. Right? 1954 didn't fix that. That's not fixed. Even now, that's not fixed. People don't have equal access to those kinds of materials, those kinds of dissemination vehicles. And so it's very easy to quite literally whitewash black creativity at this time. Here's a case in point, right? A Little Bird Told Me. Now, there was a lawsuit for this. The Supreme label recorded Paula Watson, and that's her below. And she sang the song, A Little Bird Told Me. A little bird told me that you love me, right? Simple little pop tune. She recorded it in 1948, and that's her at the bottom. She's very light-skinned, but she is an African-American woman. It was a number 2 R&B hit and a number 6 pop hit. That means it was a crossover hit. That's very high in the late 1940s. That's very high as a crossover hit, where it's a R&B number 2 and a pop number 6. But then Decca records it that same year. And they see that it's done well, and they basically use the same approach. Listen to the 2 recordings. You can find them both on YouTube. I don't think they're both on Spotify. One of them is, but not both. And you'll hear it's very similar. And they use a white singer, the one up top, Evelyn White, and it becomes the number 1 pop hit, right? And you can hear that Evelyn White, if you listen to a few Evelyn White songs, she doesn't always sound quite like that. She's clearly trying to sound very much like Paula Watson. So Supreme, the small record company, Supreme, rightly sues. Keep in mind the disparity here. Supreme is a very small independent label. Decca is one of the 5 majors. So this is not an even playing field. Decca, of course, is going to have better lawyers. Decca is going to have all the cards on their side. But Supreme sues anyway. They put together the money, they get a lawyer that's willing to take the case, and they sue. Now, the court finds in favor of Decca, claiming that only sheet music and not the arrangement was copyrightable. Now, they had paid a fee to the composer of the song because Paula Watson didn't write the song, right? So Decca paid the composer of the song, so they were free and clear. Even though the composer didn't make that arrangement. That was whoever the band leader was at Paula Watson's session, or it might have been Paula Watson that helped create the arrangement. I have no idea, but it was whoever was involved there. The people at Supreme Records, they're the ones that put together that arrangement. But the court finds that arrangements are not copyrightable. Only sheet music, and since Decca paid for the sheet music, they paid the composer to record the song. They were free and clear. Now, this decision then opens the floodgates for cover versions, because what that means is, as long as I pay the composer, I can take the same arrangement. I can do the same thing you just did. I could do it note for note. I could do it sound for sound. I could use the same instrumentation. I could have the drummer play the same exact beat. Doesn't matter. The only thing copyrightable is the sheet music, the melody, the words, the harmony. And as long as I pay for that, and keep in mind that a lot of these songwriters are freelance songwriters, right? Some of them are actual musicians where they're not going to want someone else doing their song, but that's often not the case, right? A lot of these early rock and roll hits are written by just freelance songwriters, like Lieber and Stoller. We already talked about them. There are several others working, right? And we'll talk about some songs that are written by the artists themselves, but especially when we get to, say, Little Richard and so on. But even with Little Richard, there were a lot of cover versions, because a lot of times what happens with Little Richard is he's not the one that gets to make the decision. Even though it was his song, he gets his fee, but it's all brokered through the record company, so he doesn't always get a say in it. So you have this slew of cover versions throughout this era. Shake, Rattle, and Roll, composed by Jesse Stone of Atlantic Records in 1954. It was released by Big Joe Turner, and it was a number 1 R&B and a number 22 pop, which is a respectable crossover hit. Big Joe Turner, we've talked about him several times. He was involved in the rise of Boogie Woogie. He was the singer on Rollin' Pete. He was the singer of that late R&B sound that becomes so influential on rock and roll. And this song, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, it's another one of those sort of sex songs that pretends it's not a sex song. It's a little more explicit when you listen to, and you should listen to both to get a sense. It's a little more explicit when you're listening to Big Joe Turner. For instance, there's one spot where he basically saying that the woman is wearing such a thin dress that when the sun shines, he can see right through it. Right, when the sun shines right through is what he says. This idea that he's seen some part of her naked body, they get rid of that when Bill Haley and the Commas do it. Right there, then it's shaking those pots and pans and all that kind of stuff. It's a very cleaned up version. And that version, which was recorded in 54, so the same year, is a number 7 pop, so quite a bit higher than Big Joe Turner's version. Then you have another example, Shaboom by the Chords, and those are the chords down at the bottom, and you can see it's one of the classic 5-member harmony groups. They record that song in 1954. It's a number 2 R&B and a number 5 pop. That's a very successful crossover hit. And then it's covered by the Crew Cuts in 1954, which becomes a number 1 pop for 9 weeks, right? And listen to the two versions. You can hear it's very much whited up, right? There's nothing dirty in Shaboom in either version. They keep the same lyrics, but the harmony, the way in which they approach the harmony is much more akin to Glee Club harmony in the Crew Cuts version than the R&B harmony of the Chords. So that's a useful comparison, right? But the typical jukebox music that you would have heard probably would have been the Crew Cuts more than the Chords. Although, as you can see, the Chords version did quite well, but might it have done better had there not been another version? And we're not talking about very long. We're talking about a matter of weeks or months, right? So just as soon as one of them just as soon as a recording proves itself to be viable and substantial and something that's going to sell, then these major companies jump all over it. Now, people sometimes ask, what is the first rock and roll record? And I think it's a stupid question, right? In part because of those 6 streams. What are we talking about when we're talking about the rock and roll record? Are we talking about something that sounds like Bill Haley and the Comets? Because if that's the case, then 54 would be a decent year for that, I suppose, with Shake, Rattle, Roll. But shouldn't we say that it's probably Big Joe Turner's? I mean, certainly it's as rockin', if not more rockin'. I would say it's more rockin'. It's a little less country inflected than obviously Bill Haley. So it depends on how you're defining rock. Some people think of rock as being R&B with a bit of a country inflection, in which case you might say, oh, well, maybe Bill Haley is a contender. Another contender earlier than both of those is, of course, Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, which was actually Ike Turner's Kings of Rhythm. The story goes that they were going down there to play. Down there, by the way, is Memphis. And they were going to record the song Rocket 88. And they're going to a studio run by a man named Sam Phillips. This is Sun Studios, and we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about Sun Studios pretty soon. And they recorded at Sun Studios. 1951 becomes a number 1 R&B hit. Now, there are several stories about this. Let me tell a few of them. So it's Ike Turner's Kings of Rhythm. Ike Turner is the pianist. He's the leader of the band, and he usually does the singing. Jackie Brenston is the sax player, and he's usually the side man. Now, what happens is they load all their material onto their equipment onto a station wagon. They get in, but they didn't tie the guitar amp down very well, and it falls off and it breaks. The speaker actually rips. The vibrating membrane of the speaker actually rips. So when they plug into it to play, when the guitarist plugs into it to play, it gets this distorted sound. So this is one of the early examples of distortion in these recordings. We talked a little bit about other examples by Memphis Minnie and so on, but this is a good example of an early distorted guitar sound, and you'll hear it. You can hear the damaged amp. But Sam Phillips, who runs Sun Records, he liked that sound. He thought that sounded interesting. It wasn't a sound he heard before. What he didn't like was the sound of Ike Turner's voice. He said, no, man, you want me to record this? It's got to be Jackie Brenston singing. Now, you might say, well, what business is it of his? I mean, he's just a recording engineer. He's running the studio. But he has a pipeline to Chess Records, and that's who winds up releasing this. And so if he likes the record, he's going to send it on the Chess Records, and they're going to listen to him much more likely. It's much more likely they'll listen to him than some band in off the street. So Ike Turner, of course, is pissed. I think you can even kind of see it in this photograph. I mean, look at that look that Ike Turner is giving Jackie Brenston, right? He's not happy about this. Ike Turner, as you might know, winds up marrying Tina Turner and very famously abusive toward her. Ike Turner is very rarely happy, and this is one of the early grievances for Ike Turner. Um, at any rate, the song becomes a major hit, as you can see, number one R&B, and it's one of the songs that really inspires Sam Phillips of Sun Records to say, maybe I need to have my own record company. At this time, it's Sun Studios, it's not Sun Records yet. So he says, maybe I should have my own record company, Sun Records, where instead of just sending it on to someone else and then they make all the money, and all I made was the finder's fee and the recording fee, then I would get an actual cut, a residual. And so that's what he does, and we'll talk about how that works out when we talk about Elvis and so on. So Willie Kazart, of course, on guitar, and then that rougher, you hear some rougher sax playing by Raymond Hill, and then the smoother sax is Brenston, and of course the singing. There are other contenders, of course, for the earliest rock and roll record. Some people like to think of Good Rockin' Tonight, the Wynonie Harris version in particular from 48. There's John Lee Hooker's Boogie Chillin'. It's a good candidate, 49. I think Rock a While's a good candidate. It's one of those songs you don't hear much anymore by Gory Carter, but it's an amazing song from 49. Fats Domino's The Fat Man. Certainly if Fats Domino was part of rock and roll, then that's a good early candidate, 1949. And that song becomes his signature song for a while. Some people even think of the Dominoes 60-Minute Man, 1950. Certainly has the rock and roll sound of that harmony sound, which is one of the strands. Howlin' Wolf, How Many More Years? That's one of my favorites on this list, of course, 1951. Sometimes thought of as having the first distorted power chord, right? So you have just a two-note chord. A power chord, of course, is just a root in the fifth. And you hear that on that recording. And then some people think of Big Mama Thornton's Hound Dog, right? But I would say anything that is after the Jackie Brenston recording in 51 can't be the first one, because certainly that's a rock and roll record. I don't, like I said, I don't think it's a very worthwhile question, and I think that the idea of a precise definition of rock and roll is the wrong way to look at it. Again, we're talking about a generational divide, or a shift in generational and racial thinking. It's not any kind of racial utopia, don't get me wrong, but there's more of a mixing of white and black styles and white and black audiences, and there's more of a generational divide between young and old, and that's what comes to define rock and roll much more than any sound or style exactly, right? Because there are going to be country inflected artists and R&B inflected artists and so on. Now, one of the bands, like I said, that the other one we'll talk about today of those strands, we've already talked of the streams. We talked a little bit about the harmony groups already, and I mentioned Pat Boone. I guess I'll mention him very quickly one more time at the end of this, but the northern bands, Bill Haley and the Comets will be our example. So they were originally a western swing band called the Saddlemen, but in 1953 they released an R&B song, Crazy Man Crazy, which went to number 12 pop, and so they thought, well, maybe we should start doing more R&B material with a little bit of a country sound. They signed to Decca Records in 1954, so they're on a major record company. In fact, they're on one of the record companies that's notorious for doing cover versions, which is why they wind up doing so many. And they were working with the A&R man, Milt Gabler, who of course had worked with Louis Jordan. Someone who's very successful at promoting, very canny, very smart businessman. They released Rock Around the Clock in 1954, but in 1955 it became the first number one rock and roll record, and it became number one in part because it was featured in this film that you see the poster for there, which is Blackboard Jungle, and it stayed at number one. That song stayed at number one for 8 weeks and sold 22 million copies worldwide. Now, the legend is, of course, that young people were going to see this movie, which is about these teenage rebels. It has a young Sidney Poitier in it, and obviously Glenn Ford is the teacher. And it's one of these very significant youth movies of the 1950s. There are several of them. The Wild Ones is another. These youth rebel movies, and of course, by the time we get to the early 60s, we see Rebel Without a Cause, or that might have been the very end of the 50s. I don't know, but it's of that same ilk, right? Rebel Without a Cause, Blackboard Jungle, The Wild Ones, and so on. This idea of the rebellious youth. This one took place in a school, and the legend has it that young people would go to see this movie, and when the song "Rock Around the Clock" would play at the opening, that it so invigorated them that they would rip apart the seats in the movie theater, and so that this was true teenage rebellion, right? Yeah, so these northern bands, and that's another one of the cover artists, because a lot of the songs, not all of them, but a lot of the songs that uh, Bill Haley performed or at least Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and some of the other famous ones were covers of R&B songs. Another artist who did mostly cover versions was, of course, Pat Boone. And usually I would show a video of him in class, but since we won't be there, I'll talk a little bit about it now. He, of course, we'll talk a little bit more about him. I'll save some of this for when we talk about Little Richard, but he has a very famous cover version of Tutti Frutti, which was originally a quite dirty song by Little Richard. By the time it was released on a record, it was cleaned up. But all of that excitement in Tutti Frutti, all the sort of wildness that Little Richard brings to it disappears in Pat Boone. And Pat Boone's very famous for wearing a tie and sweater, and he's this accessible teen pop star, right? So you have this element of early rock and roll that really is about taking advantage of these smaller companies and the black artists that played on them. But we'll see that there are also a lot of opportunities for at least some black artists, and actually quite a few, some of which made a major impact, like Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Fats Domino, and we will talk about them in upcoming sessions. So that's it for now. Thanks.